Deaf mechanic fixes a broken-down ambulance for free. The patient inside was someone special. The rain hadn't let up in hours, but it wasn't the storm that brought the ambulance to a stop. It was something deeper, mechanical, unseen until he arrived. No one had called him, but fate had other ways of summoning people like Hank. Hank Owens, 67 years old and nearly stone deaf since birth, had worked in the same auto shop at the edge of Millstone, Ohio for 4 decades. He never owned the shop, never wanted to. What he did want was silence, machines, and the honest rhythm of fixing what others thought was beyond repair. The locals called him the Whisperer of Engines, not because he could hear them, but because he understood them. It was past midnight when he locked up the garage, a leftover coffee in one hand, thermos in the other. The town was quiet, the type of quiet you could only really feel when you'd lived long enough to know noise. He was halfway down Pine Ridge Highway, his old pickup humming, when he spotted the flashing hazard lights. An ambulance. Off to the side. No siren. Just one paramedic waving frantically in the rain. Hank hit the brakes. The young EMT's mouth moved quickly, but Hank simply raised a hand, signaling for patience. He stepped out, water immediately soaking into his jeans, and made his way to the ambulance. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. One look under the hood told him everything. The alternator was fried. A belt was torn, and worst of all, the battery was draining fast. He tapped the EMT on the shoulder and scribbled something in the notepad he always carried. "How long has the patient been inside?" The EMT scrawled back, frantic. "Over an hour. Elderly woman. Needs oxygen. No cell signal." Hank didn't hesitate. He pulled his toolbox from his truck, eyes scanning every bolt and connection like a general surveying a battlefield. Every second mattered not for the machine, but for the life inside. Inside the ambulance, she lay still. The oxygen tank hissed softly, like a clock counting down. Her face was pale, lips slightly parted, hands curled loosely on the blanket. She didn't stir when he looked in through the glass. But something tugged at him. He had seen that face before. No time for memories. Hank worked like a man possessed. The rain blinded him. His hands, aged and cracked from years of toil, moved with urgency that defied time. He rerouted power from his own truck's battery to buy the woman inside a few more minutes. Then, working with parts he fashioned on the spot, Hank began the miracle. The EMT watched in awe as this deaf old man who hadn't spoken a word fixed what a garage full of techs might have refused to touch in this weather. Hank didn't even notice the crowd that had begun to gather near the tree line, pulled off the highway by the eerie stillness of the scene. 20 minutes later, the engine roared to life. The headlights flicked on. The oxygen unit beeped steadily again. The EMT blinked, scribbled on Hank's pad with trembling hands. "You just saved her life. Thank you. Who are you?" Hank only shook his head and turned toward the ambulance window. That's when she opened her eyes. He froze. Her lips moved slowly, and even though he couldn't hear a word, Hank knew what she said. Hank. It hit him like a flood. 50 years ago, when he was just 17 and alone in a world that didn't understand deafness, there was a girl named Lily. She wasn't like the others. She didn't mock him or pity him. She learned sign language just for him, taught it to her little sister. And once, when Hank had nothing to eat, it was Lily who snuck food from her family's kitchen, who placed a hand on his shoulder and signed, "You matter." Then, she vanished. Her family moved away without a word. He never saw her again. Until now. The woman in the ambulance, wrinkled, fragile, breathing by machine, was Lily Carter. His Lily. She smiled, the kind of smile that transcends time and deafness and every storm life throws at you. Hank reached for the glass between them, placed his palm against it. She did the same. And then she signed, clumsily, but unmistakably, "You still matter." Hank's breath caught in his chest. He hadn't signed in years, not since his mother passed, and there was no one left who truly spoke his language. But it was still there, buried in muscle memory, in fingertips that remembered more than words. He signed back, "You're still here." Tears rolled down Lily's cheeks. She nodded gently, too weak to do much more. The EMT glanced between them, confused but awestruck. Hank turned and gestured to the young man to go, to drive. The engine would hold now. He would make sure of it. No more time to waste. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the engine pulled onto the wet road again, disappearing into the dark. Hank stood there, drenched in rain, grease, and memory. His legs felt weak, but not from exhaustion. From something deeper, the trembling realization that life, cruel as it often was, had just looped around and handed him a piece of his past he thought long buried. He climbed back into his truck, water squishing in his boots, heart pounding louder than the silence he lived in. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Lily was alive, and she remembered him. The next morning, Hank sat on the bench outside the hospital, his toolbox beside him. He hadn't changed clothes. The coffee in his thermos was cold. He hadn't spoken to anyone, not even tried. He just waited. It wasn't long before a nurse came out and tapped his shoulder. She held a notepad. "Are you Hank Owens?" He nodded. She smiled gently, then wrote again. "She's awake. She asked for you," she said. He fixed more than just the ambulance. He didn't know how to react. Just stood there, as if frozen in his old overalls. The nurse led him through sterile white halls, past blinking machines and polished floors that echoed the footsteps he couldn't hear. Room 217. The door opened, and there she was, Lily, sitting up, frail but alert, and four in her arm, a blanket around her shoulders. Her hair was mostly white now, but her eyes were the same. Those same warm eyes that once smiled across a cafeteria table at a scared, lonely teen who couldn't hear the world. She looked up and signed. "I hoped I'd see you again. I didn't think it would be in the back of an ambulance." He signed back, a little stiff but clear. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again. At all." She chuckled, a sound he couldn't hear but could see in the way her chest shook, her shoulders lifted. He pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Hank, hands shaking, slowly pulled from his coat pocket a small, crumpled piece of paper. A letter. Yellowed. Worn. He handed it to her. Lily's hands trembled as she opened it. It was dated April 1975. Her eyes widened. "You kept it," she signed. He nodded. "The last letter you left before you moved. You slipped it into my coat at the bus stop. I couldn't read well back then. It took me weeks to understand it." She looked down at the letter and began to cry softly. The words came back to her, words she thought had vanished into the ether of youth. "I'm sorry we're leaving. I wish I could stay. If the world ever brings us back together, I hope you'll still be the kind, brave boy who never needed sound to be heard. I thought I failed you," she signed, after wiping her eyes. "I never said goodbye." "You saved me," Hank replied, signing slowly. "You were the first person who saw me, not the deaf boy, just me." The next few days passed quietly, filled with visits and laughter, silent but powerful. Hank came every afternoon, brought her small gifts, a red apple like the ones they used to share, an old photo he somehow still had of them in middle school, even a tiny notebook where they now wrote notes between signs when hands got tired. Lily had been living in a care home just outside of town. She had no children, no husband, never married. Too busy chasing purpose, she joked. Her health had been failing, and that night, the night the ambulance broke down, had been a critical one. "I thought it was the end," she admitted, "until you showed up. Of all people." "It wasn't luck," Hank signed. "It was something else." She smiled faintly. "Fate." He nodded. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hospital courtyard, Lily asked to sit outside. The nurses wheeled her into the garden, where Hank waited with his thermos this time, full of hot tea. "I've wanted to ask," she wrote on the notepad. "Why did you never leave Millstone?" Hank scratched his chin thoughtfully. Then he signed. "I didn't need to. Everything I needed was here. A place to work. A place to be useful. A memory to hold on to." She tilted her head. "Me?" He nodded again. Then after a pause, added, "Fixing cars was my living. Fixing what I lost with you. I never thought I'd get the chance." She reached across and placed her hand over his. "Hank," she whispered, slow and deliberate, so he could read her lips. "Maybe it's not too late." By the end of the week, Lily was well enough to return to her care home. Hank offered to drive her. It was a quiet ride, but not empty. They didn't need music or chatter. The rustling trees and late summer breeze filled the silence just fine. At a red light, she looked at him and signed. "Will you visit me?" "Every day," he replied. And he did. As the weeks turned to months, Hank became a fixture at the Oakview care home. He taught the staff basic sign language. He fixed their generator when it sputtered. He brought in old movie DVDs and played them with subtitles for the residents who couldn't hear well or at all. But most of all, he brought Lily apples. red ones, always polished. And every day, they sat in the garden and talked. About everything. About nothing. And sometimes, they just sat in silence, the kind of silence that only two people who truly see each other can share. Winter arrived quietly in Millstone. Snow dusted the edges of rooftops like powdered sugar, and the once green trees of Oakview's garden stood still and leafless under a pale sky. Hank's routine hadn't changed. Every morning, he stopped by the diner on 2nd Street for 2 coffees, one black, one sweetened, then made his way up the hill toward Oakview. The nurses would nod as he passed, already used to the silent man with the kind eyes and toolbox in his truck bed. Sometimes he fixed creaky doors, sometimes the elevator, always for free. But always he came for Lily. Her health had stabilized since that night, but age had its own rhythm. Some days, she was sharp and witty, ready to recall stories from high school or the summer they built a kite from scratch. Other days, she drifted into quiet spells, watching snow fall with a distant look in her eyes. Hank stayed, no matter the day. And one afternoon, as he sat beside her window, sipping warm tea, she handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a will. Her will. Hank blinked, confused, and looked up at her. She smiled, not sad, not scared, just calm. I have no family, she signed, slowly. No one but you. He shook his head, motioning for her to take it back, to forget it. But she placed a hand over his and signed again. You've already given me more than anyone ever has. Let me give back. Inside the folded papers was a note she'd written the last page, in her own trembling handwriting. To Hank, the boy who could never hear me, but always understood me. Thank you for saving my life not once, but twice. If I go before you, I want you to have the garden bench. I want you to have our letters. And if you're willing, I want you to share our story. Let them know that silence is not the absence of love. Hank closed the paper carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. For a long while, he sat without moving, watching her fall into a soft sleep. But as winter deepened, so did the signs. Lily's strength began to fade again. Her laughter came less often. Her steps, with the help of a walker, grew slower. Her hands, once graceful in sign, now shook when forming simple words. The doctors said it was only a matter of time. Hank didn't cry. He didn't know how. Or maybe he had already cried so much in life that the tears had run out years ago. But what he could do was build. So he went to work. Each night after the shop closed, he carved, cut, sanded, painted. By mid-January, a new bench stood beneath the tree in Oakview's garden, the very spot where he and Lily first sat months ago. On the backrest, carved by hand. You still matter, Elsie. The first time Lily saw it, she cried. Then she asked for her blanket, her tea, and her gloves, and together, they sat there again in the cold, beneath the clouds, saying nothing at all. One morning in early February, the nurse on call called Hank. She didn't have to say much. He was already in his truck. When he arrived, room 217 was quiet. The machines had stopped beeping. Lily lay peaceful, hands folded, her silver hair brushed neatly around her face. On her bedside table sat a single apple, polished and red. Next to it, a note written in shaky pen. Come sit with me under the tree. Hank sat with her for a long while, holding her hand. No sobs, no screams, just presence, just love. That afternoon, he walked alone to the bench in the garden. It had snowed again, soft and fresh. He brushed the snow from the seat, sat down, and pulled from his coat the very first letter Lily had given him all those years ago, yellowed, worn, but whole. He read it again, and then, for the first time in decades, Hank pulled out a pen. He turned the letter over, and he began to write. Days passed, then weeks. Hank returned to work at the shop. Clients came and went. But something had changed in him, something subtle, but deep. The other mechanics noticed how gentle he had become, how he lingered with older customers, offering to check their tires even if they hadn't asked. At night, he visited Oakview, still now sitting alone at the bench. One evening, a young staff member approached him shyly with a small notebook in hand. Mr. Owens? Hank looked up. She opened the notebook and showed him a message. I heard about you and Miss Lily. She was my grandmother's best friend here. I want to learn sign language too. Can you teach me? Hank blinked, then nodded. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. A reporter from the local newspaper, the Millstone Herald, came to the auto shop. She was young, maybe 30. Her name tag read, Marianne. She handed Hank a photo. It was the ambulance, the one he had fixed on that rainy night. The image had been snapped from a dashcam in a passing truck. It showed Hank kneeling beside the open hood, completely drenched, a beam of lightning splitting the sky behind him. "I've been trying to track you down," Marianne said, gently. "That night the paramedic called you a hero. We'd like to do a story." Hank shook his head. He wasn't a hero. He was just there. She left her card anyway. He didn't call her. But 2 weeks later, she showed up again, this time with a small film crew and a laptop. "We're doing a short documentary series on small-town heroes. It's called One Kind Act. Can I just show you something?" Hank watched as she pressed play. The video was simple. Images of him working, footage from the hospital garden, interviews with nurses, Oakview residents, even the EMT who was there that night. Then, the screen faded to black, and Lily's face appeared. She had recorded something before she passed. "If you're watching this," then Hank finally agreed to let someone tell the story. "He won't tell you how much he gave, but I will. He gave me a second chance at life, at peace, at feeling seen. He taught us all that you don't need words to be heard, just kindness, consistency, and a little grease on your hands." Hank Owens is not just a mechanic. He's proof that people don't have to be loud to make a difference. The video ended. Marianne wiped her eyes. So did the cameraman. Hank sat still for a long time. Then he nodded. The documentary aired the next month on a local PBS station. Then it went online. Within days, thousands of views. Then tens of thousands. Comments flooded in from all over the country. "Reminds me of my grandfather. We need more people like Hank. I cried when Lily signed 'You Still Matter.'" And one comment, pinned at the top, "This story gave me the courage to visit my estranged father after 10 years. Thank you, Hank." Soon after, the mayor of Millstone called. There was a small ceremony in the town hall. Hank didn't want to go, but the Oakview staff and a few of the older residents insisted. They gave him a medal. He tried to give it back. Then came the letters. Dozens. Some from parents with deaf children. Some from war veterans. Some from other old mechanics who thought the world had forgotten them. One letter stood out. It was from a teenage girl in Kansas. "Dear Hank, I'm 14. I'm deaf too. I used to hate it. I thought I'd never be able to do anything normal. But then I saw your story. Now I want to fix things too. I want to be like you." Hank hung that letter in the shop, right above his workbench. 1 year later, a new community program opened in Millstone, the Lily and Hank Center for Hands-On Learning. It offered vocational training in mechanics, woodwork, and sign language for youth, especially those with disabilities or from low-income homes. Hank taught the first class himself. His fingers were slower now. His knees ached. But when he showed those kids how to change a tire, they looked at him like he was teaching magic. And in a way, he was. Because Hank Owens, the man who fixed engines without hearing them, had found something far more valuable than sound. He had found connection. Spring bloomed gently across Millstone. Cherry blossoms framed the streets, and the laughter of children returned to the sidewalks. At the edge of town, the Lily and Hank Center buzzed with energy, a modest building with large windows, a workshop in the back, and a quiet garden where a new wooden bench had just been installed. Etched across its backrest, "In silence, we still speak." Inside, Hank stood before a group of teenagers in denim aprons. He moved with slow confidence, holding up a spark plug, pointing to its worn edges. Then he turned to the whiteboard and began to write in large letters. "Trust what you feel, not just what you hear." He signed the words as he wrote them, careful to slow his motions so the students, many of them just learning ASL, could follow. Among them sat a girl named Maddie, the same deaf teen who had written to him from Kansas. She'd moved to Millstone with her mother 3 weeks earlier. And every morning since, she arrived early. Every night, she was the last to leave. Hank saw himself in her, the way she stared at broken engines like puzzles waiting to be solved. The way her hands moved in sign language like poetry. The way she sometimes drifted into silence, not because she was lost, but because she was listening differently. One day, after class, Maddie approached Hank in the workshop. She tapped his shoulder and signed. "Can I show you something?" He nodded. She led him to the back lot, where an old, rusted moped leaned against the wall, barely held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. "I found it in the junkyard," she signed. "Everyone says it's too far gone." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Everyone?" She grinned. "Except me." He smiled. And that's how it started. Every afternoon, for the next 6 weeks, they worked side by side. Maddie cleaned each part by hand. Hank showed her how to sand and weld. Slowly, piece by piece, the moped came back to life not just as a machine, but as a symbol. The day it started, Maddie screamed with joy silent, but unmistakable. She jumped up and down and hugged Hank, her hands trembling. Then she signed. "You taught me how to believe again." Word of the program spread. Volunteers began to show up, retired craftsmen, former teachers, even a local nurse who remembered Hank from the hospital. Together, they turned the center into a haven for those often overlooked. Kids with disabilities, elderly residents with forgotten skills, young men on probation trying to restart their lives. Each person who walked through those doors brought something broken, and each left carrying something healed. But not everything stayed smooth. One Thursday morning, Hank sat in his truck outside the center, clutching a letter in his lap. It was from the town zoning board, a cold, bureaucratic notice stating that the property lease was under review. If an inspection didn't meet the town's new safety code requirements, the center could be shut down. Hank stared at the paper, anger slowly rising in his chest. It wasn't about safety. It was about money. The land the center sat on had recently gained attention from developers, people who saw value in square footage, not in stories. That night, Hank didn't sleep. He drove to the old garden at Oakview and sat on the original bench, Lily's bench. He placed his hand on the carved letters. "You still matter, LC." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he spoke. No one else heard it. It was just a whisper. But for Hank, it was the loudest he'd ever dared speak aloud. "I won't let them erase this." The next morning, Hank took action. He brought the letter to Mary Ann, the same reporter who had filmed his documentary, and showed her everything. She read it once, then again, her brow furrowed. "They can't do this," she said. "Not after all you've built." She contacted her editor. Within 2 days, a full article hit the front page of the Millstone Herald. They call him a hero, but now they want to bulldoze his legacy. Photos of the center, student testimonials, even a picture of the garden bench, it all went viral, again. This time, it reached farther than Millstone. News outlets picked it up. A national morning show aired a 2-minute segment on the story. Donations poured in. Over 50,000 signatures were collected in a petition to stop the zoning board. But even more powerful than the numbers was what happened next. People began arriving in person. A retired teacher from Indiana showed up with a box of books and offered to teach literacy courses at the center. A group of Vietnam veterans drove in from Columbus to help rebuild the center's deck and wiring. Even the town's mayor, previously silent, arrived on site, with his sleeves rolled up. "I was wrong," he said to Hank, signing it awkwardly but sincerely. "You've built something more important than any strip mall." The zoning review was suspended, then reversed. The land was granted permanent nonprofit status, protected from development for as long as the center stood. Weeks later, during a celebration barbecue at the center, Hank stood beside Maddie as she spoke into a microphone. A young interpreter stood beside her, signing to the crowd. "My name is Maddie, and I'm deaf," she said. "And for a long time, I believed that meant I'd never be enough. Never be strong. Never be heard." She glanced at Hank, then continued. "But this place isn't just about fixing engines. It's about fixing what the world tries to break inside you." Hank didn't teach me how to hear. He taught me how to believe. And because of him, I'm not afraid anymore. The crowd stood. Applause erupted. Hank didn't hear it, but he felt it. And he wept. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned, Hank walked through the quiet halls of the center. His steps were slow, hands in his pockets. He stopped in the workshop and stared at the chalkboard where Maddie had written earlier that day. "Silence is not the end of the story. It's where truth begins." He smiled. In the corner of the workshop, a large glass display case had recently been installed. Inside, it held 3 items. The original letter Lily had written in 1975. A photograph of Hank kneeling beside the broken-down ambulance in the storm. A tiny red apple. Above the display, a plaque read, "In memory of Lily Carter, the first to see him." That night, Hank drove home in the dark, his headlights sweeping across the old back roads. As he passed the diner, he slowed. A teenage boy stood out front, holding up a broken bicycle with a busted chain. The kid looked cold, uncertain, ready to give up. Hank pulled over. He stepped out, walked to the boy, and gently took the bike. Then he pointed to the pickup. The boy hesitated. But something about Hank, maybe the calm in his eyes, maybe the gentle nod, made him trust. They loaded the bike into the back, and together drove into the night. And somewhere in the world, a new story began. Because one act of kindness by one deaf mechanic had echoed farther than sound ever could. The sun rose over Millstone, casting golden light on the windows of the Lily and Hank Center. Inside, the hum of a dozen projects echoed faintly, drills, saws, voices speaking and signing in tandem. Hope had a sound there, even if Hank couldn't hear it. But this morning, Hank wasn't at the center. He was at Oakview. It was Lily's birthday. He sat on the garden bench with a thermos of tea and 2 red apples polished until they shone. The nurse who passed by each morning paused, smiled, and gave a small wave. Hank signed back, "Thank you." He sat in silence for a while, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside were letters he had written to Lily every month since her passing. He opened to a fresh page and began again. "Dear Lily, the center is thriving. And me? I'm old Lily. Slower now. But I still find things to fix. Not just machines, but people too, sometimes just by listening without saying a word. I miss you. I still wait for you on this bench, even though I know you're not coming. Or maybe you are in some way. Maybe every student who walks through those doors is a little piece of you, of what you gave me, and what I'm trying to give them. Thank you for saving me. I promise I'll keep paying it forward." He closed the notebook, rested it on the bench, and placed one apple on top the other he kept for himself. 2 months later, Maddie stood in front of her first official class at the center. She was 16 now, more confident. Her movements and sign were fluid, expressive. Behind her, Hank watched proudly from the back of the room. It was time. He passed her a small note. "You're ready." She nodded. Maddie would take over the beginner classes now, while Hank focused on mentoring the more advanced students and taking on a few new responsibilities. One of them being the garden expansion in Lily's name. The project was simple, a quiet place for anyone who needed to breathe. Students, staff, visitors, even people who just happened to wander in off the street. Hank spent hours building benches, planters, and a wooden archway that read, "Everyone belongs here." The local hardware store donated lumber. A florist provided native flowers. A local veterans group planted trees. People gave not because they were asked, but because they felt what the center stood for. In the fall, Hank received a letter handwritten, slightly smudged. It was from the teenage boy he had picked up with the broken bicycle many months ago. "Dear Mr. Owens, I never got to thank you properly. That night you stopped to help me. I was on my way to run away from home. I didn't know what I was doing. My mom and I had been fighting. I felt lost. You didn't say a word. Just helped. Just fixed. I ended up coming to your center. Been learning how to fix bikes, and now I help at the shop. My mom came to see the garden last week. We sat on the bench. She cried. We talked. Thank you for giving me that second chance. Jason." Hank placed the letter in his workshop wall, beside Maddie's and Lily's. He looked around the room, a wall filled with photos, thank you notes, letters, and newspaper clippings. It had become a story, not just of him and Lily, but of everyone. One evening, as the center prepared for its second-year anniversary celebration, Marianne, the reporter, returned with a small production crew. "We're doing a follow-up documentary," she explained. "It's going to be called The Quiet Hero, 2 years later." Hank shook his head. He never liked the spotlight. But Maddie placed a hand on his shoulder and signed. "You don't have to speak to be seen." So he agreed. The crew filmed quietly. They captured Hank teaching, smiling at Maddie's jokes, sanding wood in the new garden space, and laughing a silent kind of laugh, visible only in the crinkle of his eyes and the way he leaned his head back. When the documentary aired online, it exploded. Not just nationally, globally. People from Brazil, Korea, Italy, and Kenya reached out. Schools wanted to model their programs after the center. Mechanics donated tools. A group of deaf engineers offered to host virtual workshops. And then came the email from the National Museum of American Stories, a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. They wanted to feature Hank and Lily's story in an exhibit called Unsung Americans. At first, Hank resisted. But Maddie looked at him, signed gently. "If you don't go, how will the world know what you built from silence?" So Hank went. Washington, D.C. was overwhelming, too loud, too busy. But the exhibit was quiet. respectful, beautiful. Inside a glass display was Lily's letter, Hank's toolbox, and the plaque from the original garden bench. Visitors walked through with headphones, listening to interviews and narrated excerpts. Maddie stood beside Hank as a group of children entered, wide-eyed. One little girl no older than 10 pointed to the photo of Hank in the storm beside the ambulance. "Mommy," she whispered. "He fixed the world without even talking." Hank smiled. In the final months of his life, Hank slowed down more. He still taught, but only once or twice a week. He let others take the lead, especially Maddie, who had grown into a quiet, powerful force of leadership. One afternoon, Maddie brought him a surprise. She opened a binder filled with papers and drawings. "What's this?" he signed. "My college application portfolio," she replied. "I want to study mechanical engineering, with a minor in deaf studies." He looked at her, eyes shining. She added, grinning, "They asked me who inspired me most. I told them about a deaf mechanic who fixed an ambulance on a rainy road and found something precious inside." One cool spring morning, Hank didn't show up to the center. Maddie called. No answer. She drove to his house, a modest cottage tucked behind the auto shop. There, sitting in his armchair by the window, Hank had passed peacefully in his sleep. A book in his lap, a notebook on the table, a photo of Lily beside his chair. On the table was one last letter, sealed in an envelope with her name. To Maddie. She opened it with trembling hands. "Dear Maddie, I've never been good with words, so I'll keep this short. You saved me too. After Lily passed, I thought my story was finished. But then you came along with your big eyes and broken moped and reminded me there's always more to fix. You are the future of this place. The heart. Promise me you'll keep listening, not with ears, but with kindness. That's where real understanding begins. With love, Hank." At his memorial service, dozens gathered, old students, community members, veterans, nurses, teachers, and strangers who had only known him through the story. No music was played, but everyone wore a pin. Each pin was shaped like a small red apple. Maddie stood beneath the garden arch and spoke not with her voice, but with her hands. A translator signed beside her. "Hank Owens couldn't hear music," she said, "but he was music steady, comforting, full of rhythm and grace." She turned toward his favorite bench. And now, silence has taken him home. But in every wrench turned, every engine started, every student who believes they matter, he's still here. And somewhere, in a quiet garden in Millstone, Ohio, beneath the shade of a growing oak, a bench waits. The wind moves through the trees like a whisper. And on the backrest, the carving remains. "You still matter. Forever." The end.